Do Christians have to keep the Sabbath? In my last video answering the question, are Christians required to tithe 10%? In that video, I mentioned something about Sabbath keeping, and that showed up down in the comments. And so I wanted to address the issue of Sabbath keeping. This is something that's a part of my story. I grew up keeping the Sabbath, and years later came to Christ and stopped doing that. And so wanted to so it's near and dear to my heart, and I wanted to address the issue of Sabbath keeping. Are New Testament Christians required to keep the Sabbath? This was a command. This is the fourth command in out of the 10 commandments, to honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. And this was important for the nation of Israel. Sabbath keeping was very important. And so the question is, hey, for followers of Jesus, are we also required to keep the Sabbath? After all, it's in the 10 commandments. And I want to give you my answer up front is no. New Testament Christians, followers of Jesus, are not required to keep the Sabbath. And the answer for me, the reason why, is pretty simple. Because Christians, New Testament believers who follow Jesus, are not under the Mosaic law. I think an important passage that helps us understand that is Acts chapter 15. I talked about this in the tithing video, and kind of it applies in the same way. The Apostle Paul was traveling the Mediterranean, and he was sharing the good news of Jesus, and many people were turning to Christ to follow him. Many Jewish people were turning to Christ to follow him, and many Gentiles were turning to Christ to follow him as well. Now, Gentile just means not Jewish. And so many Gentiles were coming to faith in Christ. A question arose that the early church had to deal with, had to wrestle with, had to answer. And the question was this: do Gentiles have to convert to Judaism and keep the Mosaic law in order to follow Jesus? And in Acts chapter 15, this is a pivotal, important passage. This is what's known as the Jerusalem Council. Leaders in the early church came together to answer that question: do Gentiles have to convert to Judaism and keep the Mosaic law, including Sabbath keeping, in order to follow Jesus, in order to be a Christian? And the answer they came up with was no. I won't read the whole passage, but just a section. Acts chapter 15, this is in verse 19. And it says, "Therefore my judgment is that we should not trouble those Gentiles who are turning to God, but we should write to them to abstain from things polluted by idols, and from sexual immorality, and from what has been strangled, and from blood." And then they give the reason for that. "For from ancient generations, Moses has had in every city those who proclaim him, for he is read every Sabbath in the synagogue." In other words, hey, the rules that we are giving, that we are imposing, are to keep peace between the Gentile believers and the Jewish believers. But listen, this is important. Acts chapter 15, and then they write to all these churches to let them know, hey, this is the answer. You do not have to convert to Judaism. You do not have to keep the Mosaic law to follow Jesus. And they were obviously happy about that. But this was their opportunity to tell Gentile believers, hey, no, you don't have to convert to Judaism, but you do need to keep the Sabbath. Or in relation to the tithing video last time but you do need to continue to tithe 10%. But they didn't do any of that, right? They said, no, we're going to put we're going to ask you to do some things to kind of keep peace between Jewish and Gentile Christians, but Sabbath keeping isn't one of them. Right? You are not, Gentile believer, you're not required to keep the Mosaic law. And that includes Sabbath keeping. And then later on, and there's several verses, but I'm just going to read one more. In Colossians, this is a relatively famous verse, Colossians, in regard to this question, but Colossians chapter 2, 16 and 17 says this is the Apostle Paul talking. He says, "Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you." Don't let anybody give you a hard time. Don't let anybody pass judgment on you. Make some judgment about you in question to food and drink. So there's related to kind of Mosaic dietary laws, or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath. So all of those rules related to that, don't let anybody put that on you. Don't let anybody pass judgment on you in relation to those things. Verse 17, these are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. All of those things were pointing forward to the person of Jesus. And Jesus came, and the substance, and he has fulfilled all of that. And now all of that is in the past. You are not obligated to follow those rules anymore. That's the Mosaic law. You're not under that any longer, New Testament believer. Now, oftentimes, when I have a conversation about this, and I think the person in the comments with the tithing video put something like this in here, right? Oftentimes what happens next is someone will say something to me like, yeah, but Chris, Sabbath keeping is part of the 10 Commandments, which were written by the finger of God, right? The finger of God wrote those 10 Commandments. And then they stop as if almost like they've like, checkmate, gotcha, right? It's like, hey, checkmate. He wrote it with his finger. So, and that is a factual statement, but that's not an argument for anything, right? The way that I understand, if I were to sort of, in the most charitable way that I can, fill out the argument, right? It would be, hey, God wrote the 10 Commandments with his finger. Sabbath keeping's part of the 10 Commandments. It's the 4th commandment. And God wrote the 10 Commandments with his finger. Therefore, the 10 Commandments carry some extra special weight because they were written by his finger. Therefore, universally, everyone is required to follow them, and therefore everyone's required to keep the Sabbath. In the way, now correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not trying to create straw mans here, so if I don't have that right, let me know in the comments, or let me know I didn't articulate your argument clearly, but that's sort of the way that I would understand where that finger of God thing is going. But here's the thing, what makes God's finger versus God's mouth more authoritative than the other? All of the Mosaic law was given by God, right? And so it is authoritative. The fact that God wrote it with his finger doesn't make it more authoritative than something else. God has spoken all of the commands. And the fact of the matter is, the Mosaic law, including the 10 Commandments, were given on Mount Sinai to the nation of Israel to learn how to be God's people and live under his rule as a nation. The laws and the promises, all of those were given to Israel, and all of them have been fulfilled in Christ. And so, New Testament believer, you are not under the Mosaic law, and you are not obligated to keep the Sabbath. You're not under that law. Now, is the idea of a Sabbath rest a wise principle and a good idea? Absolutely. A part of the gift of the Sabbath to the nation of Israel, to a people that were coming out of slavery, right, was to tell them, hey, you're not beasts of burden, right? Like how you were in slaves in Egypt, who your only value was in the bricks that you could make and the things that you could build. You are not that. You are humans made in the image of God, and you can trust God and you can rest, right? This is a good principle. New Testament Christian, you should follow that principle. You shouldn't be working 24/7. You should take time to rest and worship and all of those wonderful things, but you're not obliged or under that law the way that the nation of Israel was required to keep that law. So that's my answer. Are Christians required to keep the Sabbath? No. Is it a wise principle, a good idea to rest? Absolutely. And so let me know in the comments. Did I get it right? Did I get it wrong? What do you think? Would love to know what you think. If you have a question, you can send it in to knoll.org/askpastorchris, and I would love to do my best to give you an answer. All right. Thanks.